brothers and sisters, so let's keep thinking of this question about how do we become saints. And I'm no expert in this by any means, but I'm just throwing together a few ideas. So we spoke about in the last video about, well, first of all, if you want to get to a destination, you need a map. You need to know how to get there. You need to figure out the roads, and basically Christ is the road. He's the path, as he said it himself. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So we're trying to become holy, become saints, is really to achieve union with God in this life in the most profound way and keep growing in that union so that we are inheriting more of God's life and light, growing more in the knowledge of God, getting to know him, that we can know God and know him intimately, not just to know that God is, but that who God is and in his heart. And God has revealed this to us, and this is part of our holiness, our journey in holiness, is growing to know him. And so we said how this is obviously through the life of Christ. And, St. Augustine, when he looks at the Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel, he says that the Beatitudes are like the portrait of the very soul of Christ and also what Christ expects us to be like. So when Christ gives the Beatitudes, he's really talking about his own interior life. What is it like to be like God united to a human? Or what does divinity look like when it's living by grace and united by grace in us? It looks like the Beatitudes. But it takes a little while to understand what the Beatitudes are. But anyway, the first Beatitude is blessed are the poor in spirit. And St. Augustine will say, well, this is the fundamental step in the life of sanctity and growing to become a saint. It's to realize our poverty of spirit, that every good gift that we have and in the world that we enjoy comes from the Lord, the giver of all good gifts, or the Father of mercies. And it's also in this poverty of spirit, really, that we discover the attitude of humility, or the virtue of humility. And this is what St. Augustine would say again and again. How do we become saints? Humility, humility, humility. And in all of us, there's pride. There's this wound in our will and our minds and our hearts. Pride to turn away from God, to do our own thing, or to not face up to reality. I would say that pride is the inability to accept reality. What do I mean? Well, humility means to accept the truth of who we are. The reality is that we are in great need of God, and we're not as great as maybe we make ourselves out to be on our own steam. If we have gifts, they've come from him. If we do successful things, it's because we've cooperated with his grace. Yes, we have said yes, but it comes from him. And so it recognizes this truth that we're in need of God. And also that I'd say there's an upside to humility as well, that positive side to humility, not just knowing our misery, but recognizing that God is great and that also God can save me. God could, he forgives me. He can remake me. He could recreate me despite whatever blunders I've done in the past or whatever, ongoing fault or weakness I have. And so it could be a form of pride to despair, to refuse mercy, because you're basically saying, no, God, I know better than you. I'm too wretched. I'm too terrible. You can't forgive me. And so that's a form of pride. It's to resist God's mercy and his goodness, to know better than God's goodness and mercy. It's like if you're already saying that, God, you're not as good as who you are. If basically that's what one says if we believe that God won't forgive us, because it seems too good to be true that God would forgive me in whatever area of my life. So humility puts us in the right attitude, the fundamental disposition towards God. And that's also to live out justice. Justice is to give God what belongs to God and to others in a great extent, is to put ourselves in the right attitude before God in this awesome holiness of recognizing who he is. But part of justice is recognizing, you could say, that our right attitude to God is that he's the Father of all goodness, and that he's also the one who demands and calls us to a high life of holiness, to live out his life in our human flesh and through the model of Christ. Okay, so humility recognizes this, but we also become human not only in our relation with God, but in our relation to God via people. In other words, how we treat people. So humility is also really important in our human relations as well. And so it can be a fundamental stumbling block in our relations with others, and the opportunities God might be calling us to grow in virtue through others. So I think a big thing of humility is also recognizing our faults before others. I mean, how many relationships, whether it's in family relationships, marriages, or friends, have eroded or corroded, or have met a sort of a kind of a no pass, a juncture of obstruction because of pride on both sides, or maybe pride on one side of the person, and then the other person's humble, willing to forgive, but the other person's not willing to release the other person with forgiveness, and holds them in bondage by not forgiving, and that's a form of pride. And so, to become a saint, I would say, is that really to look at these relationships, and as Pope Francis says, it's amazing what the little word "sorry, I forgive you" can do to transform a situation, therefore transforming one's own heart as well.